Huzzah! I have returned. Welcome back to the quiet part. I don't know what episode number this is, but today's subtitle is Money is Not the Problem. In this video, I'm going to be exploring how public education is funded in the United States. I'm going to zoom in specifically on my home state, Colorado, and I'm going to be talking about the inspiration for this video really came from, stuff like this. I see on the news all the time videos about how such and such administrator or such and such coach or sometimes teachers be stealing money from their school districts, like millions of dollars sometimes. And obviously I'm one of those people that's predisposed to think like all people in power are stealing money and education is a farce and the money's being embezzled somewhere. And that became my inspiration for wanting to talk about this topic of how is education funded? Where's the money going? And importantly, my interest with this has sparked a lot of new other ideas that I'm going to be exploring in later episodes, or in my prior episode where I talked about why I'm not having kids and the nature of money itself. So I'm going to be talking today about how education is funded and how bad it is and how surprisingly okay it is too, actually. This is not one of the episodes where I know what I hate from the beginning and I'm right at the end. There's actually a proper two-sided discussion to be had here in a lot of different ways. So I'm going to jump straight in and just review my methodologies for my research and how I educated myself on these topics. Because one of the horrible things I've realized is that in school, we don't teach students how we funded their schools. We barely even teach parents and property owners how we fund their schools. And I, a teacher who went to teacher college for a teacher degree, I'm not even just a science degree, I'm an education degree with a specialization in science. They didn't even teach me how schools are funded. They barely even discussed it. They mentioned property taxes like one time. And like, we don't get taught how schools are funded. So the irony for today is because I have no idea how to present this information any different than the way I would. We're using a PowerPoint. And this video is dedicated to Shadow Wizard Money Gang because we're talking about money. So here are my methodologies. I'm going to be focusing mostly on the state of Colorado and at some point my local school district too, which is Denver. I'm in Denver County. I'm going to rely really heavily, and I did rely really heavily on government documents. Anything actually from the Department of Education or any ancillary governmental body that is publishing how this money is spent. Similarly, I'm going to be using district documents too, pulling directly from those. Also, we'll use some anecdotes for some fun. Take a look at this graph here on the right. In my science classes, I lean really heavily into teaching kids how to read graphs because if you can understand a graph, you can understand data. If you can understand data, you can understand where those numbers are coming from and why. And this graph says a lot. We will get to it in a little bit. Okay. Moving on, I just want to overview the very basic structure of how education works in the United States. And the fundamental fact is the 10th Amendment, which delegates power to the states. Anything that the federal government doesn't have control of is officially the state's responsibilities. And it ended up essentially saying schools are state responsibilities. You need to figure out how to fund them. And that is how schools are mostly funded. They are funded within the state level and then down to the local too. The basic split, and I want you to think about this, is that property taxes make up a big part of how schools are funded. There's a lot of trouble with that already. But there's also a lot of just general state money. So something called the State General Fund, that is all the money for the entire state. That's income tax, that's sales tax, that's all the little taxes that my state of Colorado is raising. There's a certain amount of money that can come out of the entire pool of money that the government uses at the state level for funding all the things we need. Some amount of that money goes to funding the schools. So it's like a split between property taxes and the state general fund. But an important note actually is there is federal funding for education, and schools locally feel that funding and receive that funding. IEPs, or individualized education plans, which are codified under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, money for students with exceptional needs. Because the document that requires those students to have rights and a document for which to follow them and express their rights, an IEP form, because those students have those rights through a federal law, that money actually is supplied through the federal government in many cases. There are circumstances where states can provide some of the funding for exceptional needs in an IEP, but otherwise, there is some federal money hitting a lot of our schools. And generally, that money is pretty equal. It's just kind of given out all at once, or it follows students with their IEPs and their various needs. So that's the basic overview, is that schools are really a state responsibility more than anything. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to place your bets. I want you to consider that we're doing a check for understanding. We're trying to get some engagement in this lecture right now. What percentage of school funding in my state do you think is paid for through property taxes as opposed to state funding? Okay, I want you to think about this because I had expectations and my expectations were not met. I was left very confused and just kind of baffled. So what do you think? Do you think it's 50-50? Do you think it's like, it's got to be like 80% local property taxes, man? That stuff's expensive. And then state funding's like a little bit. Or do you think it's like, oh no, the state is a regime and it's funding all of our schools? Well, let's take a look at our graph. Okay, hopefully you've made your bet. I would say that my bet in my brain was like 80% property taxes and then 20% state funding. And maybe it's like funding by type. Like it's like state funding is for like the building and then the actual everything else is property taxes. No. States fund 60% of the education and the local funding, all those property taxes that we make homeowners pay, it's only like 40% of their kids' actual education, which kind of undermines part of the point of using property, or at least, the agreed upon point of maybe many average Americans. Why do we use property taxes for education? Why is it linked to property taxes? And I know you know the logical answer, but we'll get back to that in a bit. But yeah, so the split is that the state literally has to cover 60% of the actual funding, and then property taxes nowadays only can do about 40% of the funding. And hey, let's analyze some trends. The 1990s were a very interesting time. I would argue they were likely a better time for American education prior to its federalization and just all the other economic problems that the country's been facing. But still, something has clearly happened here. All right, I want to go small. Let's zoom in to be really, really small real quick. This is a document that is from Denver County, Denver School District, Denver Public Schools. This is a document that explains and codifies how all of the school buildings of every category are funded and where that funding is going. So this is where I started getting a bit surprised. I thought there wouldn't be this level of transparency. I thought that this stuff would be kind of like hidden in some way, but because it is a governmental entity, I think that is why all this stuff is so public and available. There's a lot to unpack here. I just want to zoom in on here first real quick. So this is funding per pupil. Okay, here's what per pupil means. This is a calculation of how much money each student has allotted to their education given to a given school building. And what you can see is up there, that's actually the district average, $11,272. That means the average student in Denver Public Schools makes $11,272. That's how much money is allotted per pupil, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that every student ends up taxing the education system to that exact number, right? There are some students who have teachers who are higher paid, right? Like you could have one student in a science class for like this happened, right? With me, when I was my first year teaching, I think I was getting paid like $48,000. There were other people in the building that were teaching the same subject that were making, $70,000 because they were 10 to 15 years deep into their experience. And so they were being paid higher. So this number represents how much money the school can produce per kid. This doesn't guarantee that every kid uses that much. That would be a great discussion in and of itself. Which students are drawing the most out of the, which students are calling upon the most value from the school building. I bet that data would be very unpleasant to look at based on the demographics. But so this is the money per pupil, per student on average, for some school buildings in my school district. And as you may notice, there's a slight problem. I'd love to meet the person that says this isn't a problem. Why does one of these schools make $17,000 and another one make $8,000 per student? What? And this calculation doesn't include like IEPs, right? That federal funding, which is like unique to students, and like, oh, maybe that school is a bunch of IEPs. No, that's the average just per pupil funding for those students in that building, which means that you, a parent, right? If you were a parent, you could send your kid to a school in a district, and it could be all the same subjects, right? It could be about the same size as another school. But for some reason, that building feels $4,000 more per year for your kid than another building experiences for your kid at a different building. That, I don't even know how that's legal. I don't even know how that exists. And like, how is that legal? That just sounds like some sort of civil rights violation, because you can have students who we all argue are equally valuable and equally have rights to an education, amendments and stuff, and then like one school just has like $20,000 per kid and another one has like $7,000. How is that legal? How does that even make sense? And the answer lies in how that money is spread up, but it is nonetheless a ridiculous variation. If we look at the graph down here on the bottom, let me see if I can get my mouse here visible on the screen. There we go. If we look at this bar graph, that's what this is. If we look at this bar graph, we can see some of these different. So, by the way, this group of schools, this is like what, 7 or 8 schools, 5, 6, I don't know. This is a few handful of schools. This is a handful of schools in the same category of school. So these are the same type of school. And they are in a similar area, okay? An important note. So I don't want you to compare the total value of these numbers to like an average school. These are all pathways schools. So pathways is a weakling's word for alternative school. I teach at an alternative school. One of these numbers is my school. And I don't like that there's such a variation. Am I the higher ones or am I the lower ones? I actually don't care. I just don't like that there's a significant variation. You're telling kids at this school that they're worthless compared to this school. I just don't know how that's legal. And as a parent, I'd just be so damn pissed. I would be so angry to know that, like, dang it, I sent them to the wrong one. This one gets $15,000 more. Why is that even a thing that parents would have to navigate in this country? I bet parents don't even know. And that's why I'm making this video. Remember, this channel is for parents, it's for teachers, it's for students, it's for anyone that needs to get educated on the stuff that isn't being talked about enough. So, oh yeah, I wanted to go back to this again. Yeah, you can see a significant variation. Like this is not a deceitful bar graph. These are just major differences in funding per pupil. But again, the total number is going to be probably elevated because I'm at a pathway school, an alternative school, which does generally get more funding per pupil than an average school in a district. And you may challenge me and say, well, if you care so much about equality, then you should have your alternative school be paid the same as a regular school. Yeah, go for it. I'm down. Yeah. Equality is that important. I don't care if, like, an alternative school will frequently serve students that have significant behavior needs, so significant that they are likely on an IEP, an individualized education plan. And in those circumstances, schools are legally obligated to meet the needs of those students, and that money is subsidized by the federal government. So I could see a system where the IEPs are just used correctly, and alternative schools do have the funding they need ultimately, because the IEPs are written and require the federal government to subsidize those exceptional needs. That makes sense. Stepping in when the traditional system doesn't work makes sense. But the problem is when the system is designed from the beginning to meet needs and then it just doesn't anyway, that's a waste of time. That's just awful. Hey, I just wanted to zoom in for a second on some concerning things. Do you see the table that says programs funded in whole or in part by a mill levy? I'm going to educate you real quick just for a second. What is a levy? And not the kind of Chevy levy. That's like a reservoir. A levy in education is a lifting of the amount of property taxes that a given house has to pay. And mills means 1 out of 1,000. So essentially, if you own a house and you pay property taxes that goes to the school, a certain thousandth of your total property taxes goes to that school. And a levy is a lifting of something. increases that little thousandth a little bit higher, making your property taxes higher, but also funding the schools more. This is how cursed and broken this system is. Art, PE, technology, things that might be important to have in a school are either funded partially by that increase, which is a voluntary action by voters, or they're completely funded by it. And if that mill goes away, if the voters vote to reduce or don't approve another mill levy, those systems disappear. Art could disappear. Gym could disappear. Technology could disappear, which is stressful because I care about that sort of thing, right? So that is a stupid and awful system. When entire important parts of academia, parts of education, like physical fitness, which is very, very important for America because of our food crisis and the nature of our entire nutrition. Art, which is very important for actually giving perspective to the hard and soft sciences, to the extent that those exist. Art, language arts, those sort of touchy-feely subjects have a purpose and utility. They give power and perspective to the sciences that we use to keep our infrastructure and society working the way that we want it to. So, those things matter. And they're only funded at the whim and behest of specifically property owners. What? And how much they want to pay on taxes. What? They don't want to. They're not gonna. This is a horrible idea. This is like it's like funding something based on how much people want to be shot. They're not going to. And it's like how much people specifically that own houses want to be shot. What? This is just a horrible idea. We're going to talk more about why it is the way it is, but I wanted to zoom in here and come to one of our answers of, is money the problem in education? Is the problem that we don't have enough, or is the problem that people are misusing it? And the answer is, I don't think the money's actually being misused. I am the type of wonderful person that loves to say all the time, like I love being like, the government is it's using our money wrong, it's misallocating resources. I think at the local level, state and local level, I don't know about federal, don't even talk about college. I think at the local level that school funding is pretty reasonable. Here's the breakdown, okay? Look at this pie chart. It's it's doing what it has to do. Look at this chunk. 75% of the per pupil expenses just goes to paying the teachers to do their damn job and teach. 75% of it goes to the exact thing that you would think it should probably go to, which is paying the teachers to do their jobs. Okay? And then we've got 9%. That's school leadership. That's the administrators who do all the organizing of the teachers. They literally organize the labor of the educators to make education work effectively. Okay, and then we could talk about 5%. Supplies, materials, hardware type stuff. Yeah, school supplies, they have to be subsidized to some extent because not every family can always afford them. And honestly, there's all kinds of things like printer ink and stuff like that where it's like, yeah, that's got to be paid for to make the school work correctly. Paraprofessionals. Paras are really important. Paras fill all the gaps that we can't hire enough teachers to fill. It is unfortunate we don't pay them enough either. We should pay them enough. Then again, paraprofessionals are typically less qualified than teachers. They are less educated than teachers. They have less expertise. But paraprofessionals fill in all the gaps that we can't find a teacher to fill because no one wants to teach anymore because it's awful. And then clerical positions. I'm going to be honest, I don't know what the word clerical means. I'm not even being sarcastic. I think that's like main building office staff. That's like people in the district building that like HR. I think that's what clerical means. That could be our front office people. Like we have front office attendants. I don't want to call them secretaries because they don't do just secretary stuff. They do like 1,000 things. So yeah, I mean, look at this split. Most of the money in a given school building, let's talk about just in a building, I mean, it's being distributed really reasonably, like completely acceptably reasonably. So I came into this thinking, oh, I'm going to leave thinking and realizing that like schools are, misplacing their money and they're evil and stuff. But in a school building, the money just goes to pay the people to do their job. And then there's some money for resources. I'm going to be completely real. I don't know how construction is funded at all. I don't know how school physical buildings are funded, like the actual infrastructure. I have no clue. I assume that districts take some amount of their money that they raise and use that for building things. oftentimes school buildings are built using these so-called mill levies, which again, mill levies are just an increase in the property taxes that are designed to help fund schools with things that they think they can't afford. And that schools can't afford. I want you to pay attention to that sentence. What do you mean schools can't afford things? Like, they're money from the government. Just have more money from the government, right? And that sounds stupid when you say it aloud, but the way that we are funding schools is just utterly awful. And I think one of the best ways to exemplify that is if we take a look at where this all started. And boy, does it always start in the same god dang place. The point of property taxes originally was in the 1600s. Oh yeah, it's always the 1600s. In the 1600s, American settlers came to English settlers, European settlers, Protestants? European settlers, colonists, that's a better word. European colonists, genocide people. They came from Europe. They settled. They killed all the natives while they were here, genocide, all the awful stuff. And they were like, yes, I'm here for religious freedom. I'm going to create an indoctrination methodology for more religious freedom. Listen, I get a bit secular at times. I apologize. But, I mean, that was the premise, is like, we're going to split off from Europe because we want religious freedom. The religious freedom to indoctrinate our children into our religion because we think it's cooler. They set up something called a common school. I've talked about this before. The common school was highly standardized, and it was intended to teach kids how to read and write for the sake of reading the Bible, for the sake of not going to hell in their mindset. That's the history of where schools came from in America. Like, that's where it came from. But, of course, people cared about making sure their kids didn't burn in hell. So someone at some point was like, oh, let's just do what monarchies do. Let's use taxes, property taxes locally, to fund the schools. Okay, homeowners, people that have the property, you guys are going to subsidize the education because you're the ones that are going to, benefit from it. Okay, so we're talking about slave owners. We're talking about white males. That's about it. Okay, we're talking actual feudalism type behavior. You're the property owner, and so you get the rights, and your children get the rights to be educated using subsidies from your property because you're the wealthy white, not anyone else. Slave owner, probably. Property taxes were established as a basis for funding public schools, and that became really popular across the colonies, and now it's a tradition today. And I want to discuss how stupid this tradition is. I mean, one, its roots are awful. Its roots are literally feudalistic, literally like medieval behavior, like, well, the property owners that own the property should be benefiting from this. They will subsidize and pay for their own kids' education. Listen, I'm not saying that centralizing education is a bad thing. In fact, that's where I'm torn, and that'll be our next little discussion. I think that it is totally fine and appropriate to be like, okay, let's have the society collectively subsidize education. The problem is when you tie it to property tax, you tie it to class, whether that be social class, racial class, I don't care what else, okay? You're tying it to a person's class. That is classist, and that's just the worst thing possible. It's the opposite of egalitarian, right? Only the right people have the right to benefit from their rights. It's just messed up. So the history of why do we use property taxes for subsidizing education, it's racist. Who knew that that's how it is? And of course, this system produces the outcome where the poorer a school district is in terms of its people, which tend to be gerrymandered into districts by race or other classist backgrounds, the poorest people are going to have the worst education. And that is just evil. That is downright unegalitarian. So that's the history of where we decided why use property taxes for this. Here's what I want to talk about next. So the system is hilariously bad. Okay, state funds make up 60% of the education budget, and local funds only make up 40%. And here's how the calculation works. And I did in fact read a lot on this. The state essentially says, like, okay, here's the total amount of money that we need to fund education. All right, local districts, go fund. Go take money from the property owners and only the property owners. and make as much money as you can, raise as much money as you can by levying property taxes. And whatever you can't make up, we'll just cover as the state. Sound good? Sound good. That sounds stupid. That sounds like an awful... I mean, I love the idea of the accountability, right? The accountability of like, okay, the state will make up for what the local can't figure out. But if the local's only doing less than half of the money, it's not working. The system is clearly not working. The doing property taxes isn't clearly not working to actually fund education. It's not even doing half of the work. And not to mention, property taxes are going to, again, be linked to the class of the people in that local community. That is messed up. You're saying that wealthy communities deserve better educations than poorer communities. That is evil. I mean, that's damn near eugenics behavior, right? That's like, oh, lesser people, worse education, stay lesser. Good people, better education, get betterer. I mean, it's just messed up. And here's the hilarious part. Even with the state making up the other 60%, there are 40 schools in Denver public schools that don't have air conditioning. It's 2023. They don't have air conditioning. It's Colorado. Do you know how hot it gets in August? School starts in early August. Early to mid-August? Mid-August. Doesn't matter. It's like 97 degrees some days in the beginning of the school year. And there are days where students are guaranteedly in classrooms that are above 85 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's when people start dying, dude. When I was in high school, so we're not high school, when I was in 5th and 6th grade, I believe it was an intermediate school. I was in an intermediate school and I have asthma, right? And I was a 5th or 6th grader. Probably, honestly, for both the years this was true. My middle school, intermediate school, did not have air conditioning. It was a 100-year-old building that they could never retrofit to work correctly. It did have heat, but the heat smelled like fire and dust because it was like a gas system. Either way, we didn't have air conditioning of like any meaningful kind throughout different parts of the school year. And like they were constantly trying to fix it, but they never really fixed it. I missed over 100 days of 5th and 6th grade because I just kept going home. I would have an asthma attack in the nurse's office and be like, well, it's this or die. I don't know what to do. And I'd have to go home. Because, and like, listen, let me reinforce. It was moist and hot. It was 80 degrees and the humidity was 70%. It's Ohio. There was no air conditioning, right? If I were in those circumstances at home trying to go to sleep, I would have an asthma attack. Not to mention the building was 100 years old. It was dusty and gross, and I could not breathe half the time. And gym class maybe not breathe a lot. However, I will certainly note openly that a lot of the reason I left was because like I wanted to leave, right? I'd be like, fine, I'll have an asthma attack and then go home. I don't want to be here anyway. So that was bad. But a lot of it, I probably wouldn't have even realized this idea of getting out of school free card if I had just been able to breathe because the air was like, not incredibly moist and 87 degrees sometimes. So the system does not work. Okay, the system does not work at all. And what I want to talk about next, possibly in a new location, is what is the solution? And why are both of them very not fun? We'll talk about that in a second. All right, so my fiance and I are now in the garden, and I thought the greenhouse would be a soothing place to discuss the two-sided debate. That is solutions to the money problem in American education. As you can see, my webcam is currently fighting for its life, and so am I. It is, of course, a greenhouse, so it is very, very, very warm in here. But nonetheless, I kind of wanted to just be in somewhere soothing during this discussion. But I actually, ironically, need to water while I do this, so I'm going to go do that now. So I'm currently holding a laptop with a webcam on top of it and two sunglass lenses taped over top of it because webcams are literally not engineered for this kind of dynamic range. So this is the stupidest recording setup I've ever had. So right now it's October. The garden is gardening, but it's mostly dying away. We have a bunch of lettuce for some reason, like an inordinate amount of lettuce for really no reason. Okay, I got that filled up. Take a look at this lettuce. Isn't that ridiculous? We planted those from seed like 2 months ago, and we're like, nothing will happen. And there's just an absurd amount of lettuce now. I don't even eat lettuce. I have this one. This is like half a bean plant and half a tomato plant. That's absolutely going crazy, despite it being already near the frost point. But yeah, the greenhouse is green and doing well. So the problem is with this discussion is that discussing the solution to anything in education right now means getting very, very, very political all at once, which is, of course, a bit of a touchy subject, especially for a teacher. So I'm going to try to navigate this kind of historically almost. Like I want to navigate this kind of like a history teacher would. Like trying to not... I'm going to take sides, right? But not under a political purpose, just under like, I think this sounds good on paper, and I think that would be a good solution or good idea. So here's the breakdown. The solution to the money problem in education, the solution is two other problems. Two solutions that both create new problems for everyone. Here's a split in possibilities, in options that we could work with to see if we can deal with this problem. And the split is pretty straightforward. Either we can federalize education completely, which is the communism route, or we can privatize education completely, which is the like insano-capitalist route. And both of those solutions are awful, and neither of them work really well. And both of them introduce new problems by trying to solve the current problem, which is schools are underfunded, right? Let's discuss the federalization route, because you would think to someone like me that might sound most appealing. The federalization route of education would be saying, okay, states, local districts, you failed. You guys are jerks. You can't raise property taxes enough. We're just going to take 5% of your income tax, your federal income tax. We're going to increase it, and we're going to distribute that across the entire country, regardless of state, to every student, the exact same number per pupil. Maybe, for example, $13,000. Okay, $13,000 per pupil. That's how much we have to raise. Your taxes for every person that's 18 and pays taxes, that has a job based on your income brackets, yada, yada. We're going to federalize education. Every student's going to get the exact same per pupil money going to their building. And that actually introduces problems of its own. The other possibility would be privatizing education, right? So privatizing education would mean saying, okay, we're getting rid of public school systems. We're going to make it so everything is essentially private. Everyone pays tuition. No one pays property taxes. No one pays education taxes at all. And you just use your money to go find a school that you like, which also sounds awful because essentially it's saying education is a commodity that is not a right. Now it's a thing that you have to provide for yourself. That is awful. And the biggest problem with all these ideas is that they are consequences of the current political environment. On the Republican side, right wing, I think maybe it's best to say right wing. On the right, there is a movement to, maybe I could say defund. Maybe there's a movement to sort of defund public schools in pursuit of putting in place a voucher system for schools instead. Privatizing education, making education for cost instead of it being a right. It's a thing that you have to provide for yourself or your family with your own money. That is stupid and evil. Education should be a right. Knowledge should be a free and accessible thing. The idea that, imagine the hellscape that would be in America where all school is private. You're going to have these ridiculously just indoctrinating culty kinds of schools, like, oh, this school is if you like this politician, this school is if you like this politician, that's the school for black kids. Like, that's how that would end up. We all know that that's how it would end up according to history. So the privatizing right-wing push to privatize education and have the money come from parents only, that's a stupid and horrible idea. But at the same time, using a federal system where we just split it up equally has problems because of geography. School buildings, actual buildings, are in certain places that have certain requirements. I mean, if you have a school in LA, there doesn't need to be a big budget for chains on the bus's tires, right? Whereas in Colorado, that needs to be happening. So a fully federalized system is like the beautiful communist future, and then the federalized system is a perfect communist future, and then the privatized system is like just a capitalist hellscape. So both of these options are properly horrible, and that movement to defund schools and install a voucher system is something that I will be talking about soon in a next video. But for now, that's the choices. Either we federalize education or we privatize it, because right now we've got a compromise in between. And I think the solution is to compromise again. Here's what I say we do. If I were in control, would like to see a system, a test, maybe in a state, where instead of it being property taxes, you have an income tax, and that is divided equally, and the rule is that every school building has the same per pupil cost for student learning. I would love to see how that system plays out, and I think it's most equitable and moral, primarily because only having property owners be the ones buying into their children's education is necessarily classist and going to lead to inequality. Well, I'm rich, so I'm going to fund the hell out of my kids' education. They're going to get more knowledge than a poor kid. Okay, that's stupid. Having to say that they're going to get more than a poor kid is messed up. Just give everyone an equally appropriate education. Give everyone enough, and you don't got to worry about anything else. So by doing a state property tax, not a state property tax, sorry, a state income tax that funds education per pupil to be the exact same number for everyone, excluding IEPs, I think that would be the best compromise. I think it would maintain a certain level of school choice. I mean, imagine, for the right-wingers, imagine you don't need to worry about the difference between the schools. They're all good. They're all funded correctly, and the funding isn't constantly going up and down based on how much people want to pay for taxes that year, based on how wealthy the people are in that area, based on the cost of housing in that area. Imagine being a right-winger and being like, man, now I just get to choose what classes they offer. I just get to care about what is the expertise of that school building. Oh, I want my kid's interested in engineering. I want to send them to a school that has engineering. Oh, I want to send them to a school that's interested in journalism. I'll send them to that school. But there's one thing you can know for certain. Your kid is going to be treated equally in the eyes of the government and provided the same amount of money for their education. That is the most reasonable option. I think the selfish argument of like, well, I'm not in school, why should I have income tax for education? Well, that's a really easy answer, you imbecile. You're a jerk. Because everyone benefits from people being educated. If you can't realize that, you're literally not thinking, or we failed you, and actually you're the consequence of us not educating people enough. Everyone benefits when there are more people in your society that are educated. A rising tide will lift all ships. So you want the children of the future to be educated. You want everyone's children to be educated. And I want everyone to be educated fairly. So we could pay an income tax, suck it up and deal with it. Okay, everyone gets to use roads and we subsidize those too. We should do the same with schools. But we shouldn't have it to where some schools are better than others because they get more money. That's not fair, and everyone knows that. Okay, that's inherent. So that is my idea. I think we should do a state income tax that funds education, and the per pupil cost is the same for everyone. It's just divided by the number of students. For the right-wingers, you can guarantee that your kid is going to get as much of a good education as everyone else's kids. And for the left-wingers, you can rest assured knowing that the black kids aren't literally getting less than the white kids, because that's what we're dealing with right now. It's a reasonable compromise, and the most important thing that we do right now is decouple education from property taxes. It's classist, it's a horrible history with a stupid heritage, and all it does is lead to inequality. Yes, equity has a value. Yes, equality has a value. But both of them have to be present for the system to even work at all. So, money is not the problem. I think I'll say that for this episode. Money's not the problem. Okay? There is plenty of money for funding education. The problem is, where does it come from and who is it going to? It's not coming from everyone equally, and it's not going to everyone equally either. Not even in an equal way is it going to everyone based on who's paying. So money is not the problem. I think it's where we're putting it and where it's coming from. Could we use more? Always. A cost of inflation adjustment for the American education system would be a really good thing. But otherwise, the money is being distributed appropriately. The problem is its sources and how it's being distributed, rather. Money's not the problem. It's what we're doing with it. However, paying every teacher at least $70,000 starting and having the sizes of all of our classes would probably also help. So keep that in mind.